All right. So, in order to tell this story, we've got to go back to the past. We have to go to the sixth iteration of the Marvel Universe. Yes, six. So, a lot of people don't know this, but the current iteration of the Marvel Universe, and I'm talking about the comic book universe and the MCU, all takes place in the seventh version of the multiverse. Basically, in every single multiverse, there is an egg. That egg, at the end of that multiverse, will hatch, and when it hatches, will birth a completely new multiverse. And the old multiverse will essentially die. People like Galactus are from the previous universe. He hid inside of some multiversal egg that the energies of going from one universe to another caused him to hunger, and he ended up becoming Galactus and a function of the seventh multiverse. Now, here's the thing. The Timekeepers. Technically, the Timekeepers are not from our universe. They're not from the seventh universe. They're from the previous one. They're from the sixth. There was a guy, he who must not be named. His name is based on like Voldemort more or less got like he who remains is his name. And he who remains was the last of his people before the heat death of the sixth universe. But he realized that he needed to usher or have shepherds, not himself because he was old, that would guide the new timeline so that the new timeline didn't make the same mistakes as the previous universe. And he created these beings known as the Time Twisters. Time Twisters wasn't their initial name. Don't remember their initial name. I only remember the moniker that they go by. And the job of the Time Twisters was more or less to be stewards of the sacred timeline and shepherd the new mortals along the sacred timeline to their glorious destiny. Problem is, the Time Twisters, just like their name, disagreed with their job. Why the fuck would I help these like mortal beings that when I blink they're instantly gone? So instead, they realized that the Earth was more or less the catalyst for all of the major events that happened in the universe. So every 3,000 years they would show up and they would wipe the entire planet. Now, if you have ever attempted to look at the Marvel timeline, it is a mess. There are paradoxes and issues, and the same time that the Time Twisters were wiping the entire planet and setting everything back, the Celestials were showing up to seed the Eternals and the Deviants, and a nightmare. It's a nightmare to figure out. But essentially, and eventually, Thor realizes what's going on. And he goes to the TVA to visit He Who Remains. He Who Remains is basically the guy who's over the Timekeepers. He's the guy in the background. And Thor more or less points out that, hey, these things that you created are Time Twisters. They're destroying Earth and disrupting the timeline. They can't stay. So, He Who Remains goes back in time and he erases them from existing and he creates the Timekeepers. And the Timekeepers are going to be the new ones who are going to more or less guide the universe towards its purpose. Here's the problem. He Who Remains broke his own law. And when I say he broke his own law, he created essentially the first variance, which is when he went back in time and erased the Time Twisters from existence and created the Timekeepers. Well, the Time Twisters who were already out there in and on the timeline continued to exist. They essentially became variants. They were no longer on the main timeline, but they existed outside of the main timeline, which led to a back and forth war between the Time Twisters and the Timekeepers. Sometimes the Timekeepers would wipe out the Time Twisters. Sometimes the Time Twisters would wipe out the Timekeepers and pretend to be them. Sometimes Thor would show up and kick the crap out of all sides. A mess. That's one of the things about like the Marvel timeline. If you start reading Marvel comics in like the 1980s, Like, and you read a story like Days of Future Past. Days of Future Past happens in an alternate future, right? When Bishop, Kitty Pryde, and Cable all go back into the past to do their thing and end up preventing that future, they should have ceased to exist. But because of their popularity, Marvel had to bring them back. Well, how do you explain characters who shouldn't exist anymore coming back and going back to their own timeline? Well, you explain that it was no longer an alternate timeline, but it actually diverged and became its own alternate world. Marvel trips over itself. Like, when it comes to time travel stories, it gets bad. Like, sometimes you just have to shut your brain off, because there are other times where Marvel actually makes time travel work the way it's supposed to. Like, a character goes into the past and erases someone, and then that person just ceases to exist, and it completely changes the future. There's no alternate timeline or no alternate Earth where that person continues to exist on. And it's like, well, why didn't that happen for this person, but it happened for those other people? But this is the explanation for the original variants. Who the original variants were. The original variants were variants of the Timekeepers. They were erased by He Who Remains, a being who existed from the 6th multiverse, who created them to be the shepherds of the sacred timeline, which is essentially Earth 616. And he erased them because they were more or less going against their purpose, only to create them as variants who would continue to be enemies of not only the Timekeepers, but the Avengers, and also Thor. And I'm really hoping that they show up in the show, because I think they're super dope. But that's it. That's the video. Peace.